Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to FAMM's Heart to Heart series. Today, we have an excellent program for you today. We're going to be talking about compassionate release in the States. I know many of you have asked us over and over again, how can we get compassionate release in the States, what the issues are, what you can do to advocate, and then how can we just generally move this forward in a legislature across the nation. I want to start out by introducing our guests, but also talking about the general overarching issue of aging prisons in America. And then we'll get into the specific issues with compassionate release in the States and the positive things that are coming out recently. So I'm going to start by introducing Nazgul Ganush. She's a senior policy analyst at the Sentencing Project. Lynn Reese, who is a beneficiary of the federal compassionate release laws here in America, not state, but federal. And then Kevin Ring, who, of course, you all know is the president of FAMM. So I want to start with you, Nazgul. Can you lay it out for us? What is going on with the aging prison population in the States or nationally, period?
Sure. Thank you so much, Rabia. Great to be here. So I want to start off by telling you about how I came to start thinking about these issues and then sort of give a big picture overview as you requested. So I came to this issue when I was doing my dissertation research in California on people serving parole eligible life sentences. And as part of that experience, I would spend time with families that were advocating for their loved ones who were serving life sentences. And as part of that, I once took a trip with them, actually a couple of trips to Sacramento to hear the parole board talk about the group decisions that they had to make. And I would hear people who were eligible for medical parole having their cases discussed. And so these were cases where people were in wheelchairs or they were terminally ill. They didn't have much time left to live. And I would see when these cases were being discussed that the prosecutor's office would send somebody to testify and oppose the release of the individual on medical parole. And that was really eye-opening for me because in several cases it would be, well, this person's not immobile, so it's not safe to release them to a nursing home. Or, well, this person is immobile, but we think that he might live longer than 6 months, so we oppose it for that reason. And in many cases, it was because of the underlying offense that the person had been convicted of, often decades ago. So then fast forward a couple years, and I was at the Sentencing Project looking at parole eligible life sentences, and I requested data from states on how many people were serving these sentences and how long they served by the time they were released. And I saw that people were serving very long sentences, and many times people were dying in prison waiting for parole. And so I remember I got data from Illinois, and I was going through the data set of people who had died recently in that state in prison, and it included people who were in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and I would look at how long they had served in prison before their death. And several of them had served over 60 years in prison before they died. And so I think that, these two sort of anecdotes based on my research experiences illustrates the problem that we see in the criminal justice system, in sentencing, and in particular with medical parole or compassionate release, which is that a lot of people are getting very old in prison, and that's not adequately recognized when it comes time to decide whether or not to release them. And the release decision is really politicized and a lot of times focused on the underlying offense that the person committed a long time ago. So now to just kind of zoom out a little bit and give you a big picture, what we know is that 10% of the state prison population is over age 55. And so that would be generally a population that we would consider to be elderly. And a substantial proportion of those people, about 40% of them, have already served 10 years in prison. And so those numbers are significant because we know that one of the reasons we have mass incarceration is that a lot more people have been going to prison. Their sentences are very long. And they're also, the process of letting people out has gotten narrower over the years. So fewer governors are granting clemency. There is just less parole for people even who are eligible. And then also compassionate release is something that's not really very rigorously considered or applied in these cases. And just one final thing about the fact that a substantial portion of these individuals have served 10 years. That's important because criminological research is clear that as people get older, they're less likely to commit crime. And that 10-year mark is actually important because the research shows that most criminal careers last maximum 10 years. After 10 years, people are very unlikely to recidivate and reoffend. And so it really raises the question of what are we doing when we hold people in prison for such incredibly lengthy sentences, even when they're ill, even when they're extremely ill and they're dying, and we keep them in prison and not let them out earlier. And it's, and I can get into this later, but it's extremely expensive as well. So it raises questions of, what are the best investments that we should be making to promote public safety?
So thank you so much for laying the groundwork for us. I want to pivot to Lynn. Lynn, I want to ask you, as someone who has been in prison and served time there, what is it like, or what has your experience been with people and seeing and actually being a person who is elderly in prison? What are some of the challenges people are facing? What are some of the things you face personally?
Well, the main thing about the question of compassionate release is it's normally in the hands of the prison officials. And the prison officials' jobs are like to keep you, within the fence. And it kind of conflicts with what they do. Their job is to keep you in there. So in 2018, when the federal legislators passed the First Step Act, what happened was the responsibility for determining compassionate release was transferred from the executive branch of government to the judicial branch of government. I got out on compassionate release by my trial judge and not the director of the prison system. Before that, the director of the prison system, the wardens, and the people who officiate the prisons had repeatedly denied people compassionate release that were in terrible condition, people in wheelchairs, people with no legs, people with one arm, and they were like 70 years old, and they were being denied compassionate release. And what happened was the legislators saw that the prison officials were scarcely taking advantage of the compassionate release laws, and that they were rarely letting people out. Many people were dying with their applications pending before the prison officials. So the First Step Act took the responsibility away from the prison system and put it in the hands of the sentencing judge when the prison officials failed and refused to promptly respond to the applications. And this is the problem that you deal with in prisons, state and fed, is that the prison officials don't always adequately and accurately respond to the applications. Sometimes they just lay on the desk inactive for months, and there's no such thing as a time limit within which they have to respond. There's nothing you can do to expedite the situation, and a lot of times your application may lay within the system itself for years, and you die with your application still pending. And the First Step Act was an act that alleviated this type of problem. The federals don't have this problem anymore, because when the federal officials fail to accommodate the application, the jurisdiction automatically transfers to the trial judge by virtue of the First Step Act that they passed in 2018. My application had been pending for like a year.
Lynn, hey, let me ask you this question though. You're doing a great job, but the thing that I wanted to ask you is because I want you to actually help the audience understand what it's like to be elderly or sick in prison. The problem is that a lot of people who are on the outside have no idea what that looks like, and they have no idea why that's a problem. And we know federally what happened with the laws, and we'll talk about that a little later. But can you just talk about literally what is it like for someone, or even people you've seen, friends you've had, who have been sick or elderly in prison?
The greatest problem with elderly prisoners is medical attention, adequate medical attention. A lot of times they don't have access to the medications that they need, and they're like given generic drugs to like just move them along. You know, it's almost like if we don't have apples, if apples is what they really need, to prescribe apples, and you don't have apples for the prescription, we're just giving pears, and it's okay. So that's the problem that you have is, first of all, the medical providers in the federal prison, I think in the state prison also, are contract laborers. They're contracted, and they go home every day, just like you go home at 5 or 6 o'clock. They go home. Should something happen in the middle of the night, from 6 p.m. to 6 that morning, then the guy could die before someone's there to like render medical attention. There's just really not proper medical facilities to accommodate what the elderly need. Also, the diet. The diet is the same regardless of what your age is. At a certain age, with a certain condition, your diet must change, and it's not changing. Certain conditions dictate certain types of eating habits, of eating foods that you need, and you don't have access to get them. The prison system primarily feeds you a bunch of carbohydrates, a bunch of starches, and that's it. Relatively few fruit, and if you get veggies, they're mostly like canned veggies, something from the can that's been built on the shelf 10 years, and they open it up and serve it to you. So you don't get like vital, nourishing foods that you need to survive. You don't get adequate medical attention that you need to survive, and they don't have like facilities for that can like help the people that's incapable of walking, like in wheelchairs, like rehab. They don't have rehab facilities in the prison system. They don't do rehab work. There's no one there to rehab you. You just got to figure out a way, if you can, to do it on your own. There's no rehab facilities. So those are the problems that the elderly guys really deal with.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for that, Lynn. I know it seemed like a question that we all should know or kind of have a feel for, but it's just that people on the outside have no idea. And I can imagine that people in prison face the same issues that the elderly and people who are ill have on the outside. I mean, there are hospice needs, there are just getting around, sometimes help with putting on clothes, just different things like that. I guess the older you get. And so I think that you just really outlined and showed us exactly what we're looking at when we're talking about people aging in prisons. Kevin, I want to pivot to you, and I want to talk, this lock them up and I guess throw away the key kind of approach. How has that led to this growing aging prison population and the need for compassionate release in the States?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to everyone who's with us. I just want to piggyback on one thing Lynn said and the question you asked him. I was in federal prison for a short period of time, and I was surprised at some of the people who were serving there who were in wheelchairs and who couldn't get around. And to Lynn's point about no care, I mean, there was a guy that, you're going to a communal bathroom. So think about just even things that you don't have a nurse. So this guy, was wearing, he needed like a support diaper and things like that his bunkmates had to help with. But there's just nothing there for people. So, and the reason that's important is because no matter what your motivation is for reducing incarceration, everybody knows that public safety is a goal. And what you can't get around when you look at some of the people that we lock up is that we're no safer for having them in prison. That they can't do anything. They're a threat to no one. And so, but why are they there? They're there because starting in the 80s and 90s, through the use of mandatory minimums and other sentencing laws, habitual offender laws, repeat offender laws, 3 strikes are out are things people know. We started locking people up and throwing away the key. And the result of that has been people serving these long sentences and never getting out. And so you have this older prison population of people that, like I said, after 20, 30 years, they're no risk to the public. They're expensive to maintain, but we're still holding them. And it's because of the policies we've adopted. That's why this has happened, is because we used to not lock people up for this long, and now we do.
So I want to pivot to Nazgul. Can you walk us through? We've been throwing out this term, compassionate release. I think I've said geriatric parole. I know that there's different terminology across states. Can you kind of walk us through the terminology and what we are actually talking about here when we say those things?
Sure. So it's either called medical or compassionate release. And what it means is allowing some possibility of reassessing whether someone needs to be still incarcerated because they have a serious medical condition. That's typically what it means. And more recently, for example, as part of the federal reform that Lynn was describing, compassionate release is being considered a little bit more broadly to consider whether someone who is has spent a considerable amount of time in prison, is no longer a public safety risk, should still be incarcerated. So, for example, Washington, D.C. also recently passed a compassionate release law, and it requires people to be over age 60 and have served at least 25 years in prison and meet other criteria, and they can petition a judge for early release. And so that's sort of that's a bit of an overview and specific example there.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Kevin, I'd like to pivot to talk more about how what are some of the barriers for getting compassionate release into the states. So Lynn did outline for us the federal and what happened at the federal level. But what are the barriers to compassionate release in the states, and what are we actually talking about when we say compassionate release in the states?
Sure, and I want to split this into 2 categories. And one is sort of the political barriers. What are the barriers to reform? And the things we see there are just this impulse towards retribution, that people think if you committed a serious crime, you should do the time. If it's a life sentence because you took a life, that you deserve the punishment you get. And it doesn't matter how old you are. And there's some understanding that if you're Bernie Madoff and you commit your crime at 60, that you're in a different category. But what we're usually talking about is people who committed their crime when they were younger and they stayed in prison. But so there's this retributive impulse. We're a very vengeful society, and we think, you did the time, I did the crime, you got to do the time, and that time has to be a lot. There's also concerns about victims and the impact it would have on them for shortening a sentence. Usually survivors of crime take some comfort in the fact that a person was sentenced to a certain period of time, decades or years, and they count on that. They're told that that's how long the person's going to be. And so to reopen that through compassionate release, sometimes even clemency, other processes, the concern is that you're re-traumatizing the victim, who's now going to have to be told this person who hurt you or your loved ones is getting out. That's another concern people raise. And then there's also the idea that when people are very old or infirm, where are they going to go? I mean, how are they going to take care of themselves? Do they have anywhere to go? And so those are sort of the political barriers. But a few years ago, Mary Price, our general counsel, wrote a report about state compassionate release, and she surveyed all the states in the District of Columbia. And the report was called Everywhere and Nowhere, because what she found was everywhere had some process, except for Iowa, but nowhere was it used as robustly as it could be. And those there she found barriers that are more specific barriers to why it wasn't used as it could be. And those are things, so she looked at like who's eligible, and Nazgul talked about some of this. Who's eligible for this? What documentation do they need to establish that they deserve compassionate release? Who decides? Is it a parole board? Is it the corrections office? Is it the governor? And then what happens when that person's released? What she found from surveying all the states in the district is that there were certain barriers to why this wasn't being used robustly. There were things like strict eligibility requirements. And for example, like in Georgia, you had to be completely incapacitated. You didn't have to be run down. You didn't have to have served 20 years. You didn't have to just be less of a threat. You had to be entirely incapacitated. So that's incredibly strict. You're not going to get so many people who fit that category. Then you had categorical exclusions. Things like you committed a certain type of offense, so automatically you're ruled out. You might have committed a crime that left you with a life sentence, so we're not going to consider you. You committed a sex offense, we're not going to consider you. So those are categorical exclusions. Then there was things that she found sort of complex and time-consuming processes, right? So I've got to file paperwork, and then it's got to go through a couple different review processes. It's very bureaucratic. And if you're older, and you're in prison, you don't have a lawyer, an advocate for you, navigating that process is very difficult. And in some systems, you know, the family's not allowed to help. You don't have a right to an attorney through that process. So there's all these practical barriers. And then in some states, the problem is release planning. You know, do they have a way to help you get out? Are they helping you plan? Because knowing that you have to have a release plan, is there something in place to help you get your Medicaid benefits, right? Because you're going out, you don't have a job, you may not have had one for 20 years. So there's all these practical things. You may not have an ID. Your family has moved on or they've passed away. And so release planning is important. And so there's all these practical barriers that need to be overcome, and they have contributed to no one getting it. And so the goal of reform is, one, to overcome the political barriers along the lines of what Nazgul said, which is, these people are not likely to reoffend. We're wasting money keeping them there. It's inhumane. And then we've got to address the practical barriers. How do we address these issues so that we can start getting?
Okay. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much. Nazgul, do you have any additions that you want to add to the barriers that we're facing with compassionate release?
Well, I think Kevin did a great job with this overview, and the report by Mary Price is very helpful overview as well. I would say that, you know, I guess a couple of things. You know, I think the biggest holdup in compassionate release, in my view, is the underlying offense of the individuals that we're considering, right? Because if you're an older person in prison, you know, increasingly, you know, and that's been the fastest growing population in recent years. You know, the rate of incarceration for younger people has been coming down, but it's been going up for older people. And that's for two reasons. One is because people in the era of mass incarceration have just a lot of people have acquired a criminal history. And so when you go up to be sentenced at age 30, let's say, if you committed a crime, you're going to end up with a longer sentence if you have a record already. And more people are going and getting sentenced in that way. And so they get longer sentences. But another factor is that people are just getting these very long sentences to begin with because of the crime that they committed. You know, we at the Sentencing Project have done an investigation of how many people are serving life sentences in prisons, and we found that 1 in 7 people are serving a life sentence. So this is going to become a very big problem, you know, as these people age, and as prisons have to provide some level of care for them that hopefully meets, you know, constitutional requirements, which a lot of states are struggling to do. So the underlying offense is a really big deal here, because when you look at the overall prison population, half of people in prison nationwide are serving time for a violent offense. And that's a wide range of crimes, from assault and robbery to homicide and sexual assaults, right? But when you look at the older population that we're thinking about here, 2/3 of them have a violent conviction, because, you know, that's the kind of crime it takes to be, you know, often generally to stay in prison in old age. And so we really need to educate policymakers and practitioners about, not just recidivism issues around long sentences, the fact that people who come out from prison with violent convictions or who are very old and have served life sentences are extremely unlikely, in particular the very elderly who've served life sentences, they're very unlikely to recidivate, but also that long sentences are not effective as deterrents from preventing other people to commit crimes, because people generally don't expect to be caught. They don't know about the long sentence they face. So it doesn't make sense from a public safety perspective to be spending so much money incarcerating elderly people when there are so many other things that we need to invest in our society in order to promote public safety. But there's also, Kevin mentioned, victims and their role in this process. And I think it's really important to think about that, because, these are a lot of times not victimless crimes. But there again, I think we need to make sure to hear from the broader voices of victims that are increasingly part of this discussion. So it's no longer the case that victim and survivor advocacy groups uniformly support keeping people in prison forever or for extremely long terms. We increasingly hear from victim advocacy groups saying that we actually want to invest in root causes of crime, that our members have a variety of perspectives on what level of punishment is sufficient. And then, so I think it's really important that people that are interested and directly impacted by mass incarceration and want to end mass incarceration also invest their efforts into restorative justice programs and programs that help people that are survivors to recover from the trauma that they've experienced, because we can bring a lot more people to the point of realizing that it's not necessary to continue to imprison somebody who hurt their family member decades ago. So we can help people to heal more than we have been, and criminal justice practitioners play a really key role in that. And just one final thought about victims: Danielle Sered, who leads Common Justice in New York. She and they do a restorative justice work, including among people that are victims of violent crime. This is a quote from her that I think is really powerful. She said, she's written that a survivor-centered system is not a survivor-ruled system. Valuing people does not mean giving them sole and unmitigated control. The criminal justice system maintains a responsibility to safety, justice, and human dignity that it should uphold even when those interests run contrary to survivors' desires. This is something that we do with the death penalty now, as our country has moved away from capital punishment. We do not. If a victim wants capital punishment for their loved one's crimes, we say no in many instances. We need to begin to think about how to move in that direction with extreme sentences, and in the cases of people considered for compassionate release, and how to help people get to the point where they're healing and healed and not opposing release decisions in these cases.
Thank you. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about what's happening in the States. I recently, since I've been at FAMM, and I've been at FAMM about 4 years, and we went from a situation where hardly anybody was doing anything about it to lots of bills being introduced. I'm probably exaggerating on lots of, but there are several states who have started to introduce bills. This is starting to become an issue that people are trying to take up. Kevin, can you talk a little bit about the legislative landscape for compassionate release in the states? What are we looking at? Who's doing it? What are they doing it? And then Nazgul, I'm going to pivot to you, and I want you to talk about a little bit about why they're doing it. Unmute, please.
Sorry, I was trying to be good. A year of COVID. I'm still muting myself. Yeah, we are starting to see more bills introduced. We're not seeing, radical transformation, but we're starting to see the discussion happen. Part of which, for the reasons we've discussed, which is this is another way of getting at excessive sentences. States are facing tight budgets for their corrections departments. And as we've mentioned, this is an expensive category of people for little public safety benefit. And so if you were going to safely decarcerate, this is the group you would look at. And we've got more research that indicates, that these folks are less likely to reoffend. So I think there's a growing awareness that we have to do this. Then I think you had COVID hit. And when COVID hit and these states didn't have mechanisms to get people out, that became even more glaring what a problem that was. Departments of Corrections were saying, already you had this sort of vulnerable population that didn't need to be there in the first place, and now they're being targeted by a deadly virus. I mean, it was just the perfect storm. And so I think you're seeing more states look at it. We're, Illinois, New Mexico, Oregon, there's effort going on right now in a bunch of states, some broad, some narrow, but to expand compassion release. We saw in Massachusetts where they passed a reform a couple of years ago, and the Department of Corrections was able to get a bunch of people serving life out. But we also saw the downside of that because as soon as they let people out, some of these people were serving life, some had been convicted of murder. There was a complete backlash because some of these people who were let out had been on ventilators, they were at risk of COVID, but as soon as they got out, if they didn't die immediately, if they recovered, there were people clamoring them to go back in. And so we still have a lot of work to do on this, but the discussion's happening, and that's what has to happen. I want to shout out to the Sentencing Project because they've been focused a lot on this sort of 20-year maximum sentence idea. And we just have to reorient people that you can get your pound of flesh. It doesn't have to be life, it doesn't have to be 50 years. We can have long prison sentences for some people who, do very bad things or who commit number of crimes, but we don't have to throw them away completely because it doesn't make sense. And I think compassionate release is sort of the camel's nose under the tent to address those long sentences, right? It's hard to go into the front door and say to somebody who committed this violent offense, we just want to reduce their sentence. We think we're being too harsh. That's hard to do for any politician. But to say, can we at least on the back end look at whether this sentence is still working and whether we need it and whether there's still a threat? And so I think that that's what compassion release is allowing us to have those discussions. COVID has helped that. And so a dozen states have been considering it. I think there's a handful that will pass reforms this year and will make progress.
Nazgul, do you have anything to add? Especially, I kind of want you to talk about, if possible, the cost of elderly prisoners, and as well as people who need medical care, and how that plays into, or if at all, does that play into why states are looking into this?
Yeah, I think that that's definitely a factor, since it's more expensive to incarcerate elderly people and provide them with a level of healthcare that they need, which is often underserved, as Lynn was describing, that people are not getting the level of care that they need. But let's say when they need to go off-site to get treatment, well, if you're not an incarcerated person, you would go, let's say, to a medical facility to get treatment. But if you're an incarcerated person, you're going to have a couple of guards coming with you for that treatment. And so it's not just the cost of the healthcare itself, it's the fact that it comes with all this additional security that in many cases the person does not need. The person is no longer a public safety risk. So I think the cost is part of it. And then I would also just add that I think in recent years, there's been more of a recognition that these extremely long sentences that people are serving have a certain a degree of racial bias embedded in them. They came during a time when a lot of these people were sentenced during a time when people were talking about super predators. Some criminologists, it was a popular trope in the media and among elected officials as well. So these individuals that we're seeing now who've served decades in prison, that was the era that their sentences were determined. And we know that Americans and white Americans in particular are more likely to give someone a longer sentence and support a very punitive response to crime when the person that's being considered for sentencing is a person of color. So I think that right now, as part of this process of looking back at these very long sentences through executive clemency, parole, second look reforms, and medical and compassionate release, it's all part of a process of it's all part of the racial reckoning that we're having to undo some of the ongoing, but also especially the historic impact of racial bias in our criminal justice system.
Thank you so much. I know that for a fact that a lot of these questions were also being considered with the federal compassionate release. There were people who had sentences that were long that people felt like they were going to be a threat to society, and all of this stuff, and yet they still were able. The legislature was able to make some changes. Lynn, I want to talk to you a little bit about what does that mean to get compassionate release, to be somebody who is actually a beneficiary of that system, and why is it important that people do that generally, states, federally, and were you a threat? Did you felt like you were a threat? I mean, and I hate to to put you on a spot like that, but I just want you to kind of talk about that. Like, people have like the big scary bear in their head. They really do. And is that what we're talking about? Would you say that? Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm not the big scary bear. let me, we first have to take into consideration the political atmosphere of the people that facilitate, run, that are in charge of the prison system. We're talking about a very conservative, politically conservative group of people that run the prison system. Just like we were surprised January 6th to see who some of the people that stormed the Capitol were, who some of those people in that crowd were, ex-military people, ex-police officers and all that. Well, you must take under consideration, you got that same conservative mentality that run the prison system. Just like we're having a difficult time with police and community consolidation. You got the same situation inside of the prison. The only difference is there's nobody inside the prison with cell phone cameras to show you what's really going on, how they're treating the elderly, how they're treating the ill, the sick. No one's showing you what's happening to those people. But back to my compassionate release. Having gotten out on compassionate release, I found out that there are so many organizations, so many people, and so many programs outside that's willing to help the people that's getting out. When I got out, even I got out into, a wonderful situation. Still, there were people calling me, asking me if I needed anything. People sending me boxes with clothes in them. People sending me addresses where to come if I needed any kind of, you need food, you need housing, you need clothes. Call this organization. There are a lot of people outside willing to help the person if the person is actually compassionate release. If they actually release that person, he got help. But what you're running into is a political situation where the politician in office does not want it on his record that he's soft on crime. And if 10,000 people are released on compassionate release, and one of those persons offend in a very violent way, or in a very critical way, it goes back to the politician and those people that were in office that were responsible for overseeing his release. And a lot of politicians duck that responsibility. They don't want to be thrown under the bus. They let 10,000 guys out, but one guy got out and shot someone. you know. So this is a barrier toward the compassionate release as well. You know, the politicians are worried about their personal careers because a lot of politicians campaign against the opposing political person because they throw that back in their face that he let John Doe out and John Doe did this. This is the guy that's soft on crime. And a lot of the people in office are neglecting, refusing to consider compassionate release for political career reasons. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I totally get you. Kevin, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to jump in because, I mean, Lynn's right. Jailers are going to jail, right? I mean, we have checks and balances in our system because, you know, people say prosecutors. I've had my issues with prosecutors, but prosecutors prosecute, and defense attorneys are defense attorneys. You have to have checks and balances. We have judges who are independent because we don't trust system actors to see the big picture all the time. They have a job to do. When you're a hammer, everything's a nail. When you are a warden, your job is to not let people escape. It is not, in their view, to look for people who no longer are a risk to reoffend or who need medical care and to get them out. They're just not doing that. And so the thing that worked in the federal reform was not that all of a sudden people got compassionate. It's that Congress changed the law so that people like Lynn and his family could file in federal court. If the Bureau of Prisons said no, or they didn't respond in a timely way, which is what they used to do, they used to let people die waiting to get an answer from them. Now you could file in federal court, and now you had a judge, to Lynn's point, who isn't worried about re-election, you know, who now has the ability to resentence somebody, and that is what they do all day, is sentence people, so they know how to weigh risks and factors and things like that. That is what made the federal system work, to the point that we used to get a dozen or 2 dozen compassionate releases a year. After the first year of the First Step Back, there were 145. And then since COVID hit, there's been over 3,500. 3,500 people released under compassionate release. Every state would love a system like that. But to do it, you have to remove the political actors. You have to let people get to an independent court or somebody to review this, because otherwise, jailers are going to jail.
Yeah, I agree. No argument for me on that. I do want to pivot a little bit to some of the questions that we're getting from folks who are watching, because at the end of the day, a lot of people want to know, how can I get my loved one out on compassionate release? And they have very specific questions about not just their loved one, but what can they do? The first thing is, when it comes to state compassionate release, if someone were to apply today, is it possible to be successful? Now, I know there are a lot of states and I know that there's different jurisdictions, but for someone who would randomly call and say, hey, I think my loved one is in state prison, what do I need to do to get them out on compassionate release? What could we say to them? What is there to say? What is the actual reality? How do we help someone?
I'll start, and then I'll ask Nazgul to supplement this, because my answer is a biased one, because I didn't know if this resource existed elsewhere. But if you go to FAMM's website and look at Mary's report, it concludes with 51 state memos that lay out for you what's the criteria in your state. Your loved one may just not qualify because of the things we talked about before. They may not be the right age. They may have committed the wrong offense. So there's some things that you just may be excluded from, you know, from the get-go. So the first thing is to educate yourself and see what the state allows. And there may be other resources out there. So, you know, I don't know if other, whether it's National Conference of State Legislatures, I mean, it is a daunting process to try to figure this out, because there's a law and there's regulations and you're not an attorney, and so it's not always easy. But I would do one of two things. One, you know, if you're a family member, you know, look at our memos on these topics. And another thing is, I would have my loved one ask inside the prison. I know they might not get an answer, but just say, what are the rules? What are the program requirements? Because in some facilities they will tell you. And you at least want to know what those parameters are and whether you could benefit.
Nazgul, do you have anything to contribute? I mean, of course you have things to contribute. Said the wrong thing, but you know.
A little bit. I guess I would say that given, as Kevin was describing, the parameters are really narrow to qualify in a lot of states for compassionate release, to try to explore all the options for, for resentencing. So, is there a second look possibility where prosecutor can, could you get in touch with a prosecutor to petition for resentencing for the individual? Would it be possible to request executive clemency? In all of these ways of getting sentencing relief are all pretty narrow, unfortunately. And so then, if you can, take the next step to be involved in advocacy, to try to broaden the criteria for compassionate release, to try to strengthen second look policies. Reporters are, in many places, have been quick to jump on stories where, as Lynn was describing, when someone is released and they slip up, let's try to get more attention on these cases where people are no longer a public safety risk, but they're suffering behind bars, so that the general public can get a better sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about the incarcerated population. It's not just the person and the story around the crime associated with their time that they took their mugshot. Decades have passed, and try to educate people in your network if possible, and try to broaden from that. We know that during the time of COVID, there has been a reduction in the prison population. It's been very modest compared to what it should have been during this time, given the risk that people faced. So Vera Institute, for example, has done an estimate that there's been about a 13% reduction in the prison population over the course of 2020. That's not nearly enough. And so far, we know that about 2,500 people have died in prison from COVID. Many of those people should have been considered for compassionate release, either because they were elderly or high risk to begin with because of their medical conditions, or at the time that they contracted the disease, they should have been very seriously considered for medical parole, so that they could die with dignity, die outside of the walls of prison institutions that they were in. So I think that figure really highlights the failure of the current system that we have, and the need for pushing to change the rules.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to your point about reporters being able to tell different types of stories, as somebody who works with reporters every day, and as somebody who is passionate about how we communicate these issues, I will say that I do wish that we could just take a camera and go through a prison, especially and see and follow somebody who's elderly, sick. These images are powerful. The problem is that we don't have access to them. And it's hard to tell those stories if you don't have access to the prisons and if you can't get permission. And as advocacy group, it's hard to get permission to do that. But even as reporters, they're not given as quick of an access as they should. So I agree with you 110%. And I think as advocates, we will continue to try to get those stories to reporters, and reporters I know want to tell those stories, and we'll continue to work on that. But I 110% agree with you. So the question about violent offenses, there's somebody asked us, does an assault charge automatically disqualify you for compassionate release? I know it depends on whether you're federal or state, but like generally, if you're applying for state compassionate release, how do you know? Like when they say that you're disqualified for these offenses, how do you know categorically what that means for you, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is, as you said, at the federal, there's no exclusions. In a lot of the states, the exclusions are reserved for more serious offenses. So something that was an assault is not usually going to be it. They're going to look at, the things you think about, murder, sex offenses, or based on how long your sentence is, if you're a life without parole sentence. The thought being that if a judge sentenced you to die in prison, it's not a changed circumstance that now you're going to die in prison. So that's the thinking. But things like assault don't typically exclude you.
And then we have another question. Does a person in prison have to be over a certain age, regardless of their health condition, for compassionate release? So let's just say do you have to have a medical condition and be over a certain age, or do you have to only be over a certain age? Again, I know that it depends whether it's federal or state, but if somebody could clarify that, that would be great. Lynn, go ahead.
I think that's a good point that you brought, a very, very important point that you brought up, because I was released on compassionate release, not because I was like terminally ill or critically ill. Since I've been out, my occupation is I drive 18 wheelers cross country. And I got out on compassionate release. And the reason why is because one of the most critical factors in compassionate release is what you do when you're in your criminal conduct, your disciplinary record inside of the prison. What type of conduct and character have you displayed over the years while you've been in prison? This is one of the most critical factors that's considered in compassionate release, because the major factor is, will this guy be a risk, a public risk, once he's out? And they use your conduct and character to make that determination. See, and a lot of guys in prison have taught GED classes for 20 years, have used their education to better the other people, to help the other guys, teach. And when they don't have adequate employees like teachers and nurses, and the inmates are doing that. And a lot of the inmates have done that like decades, taught class, graded papers, taught, and have not had a violent charge, any kind of disciplinary records, and have clean disciplinary records. And they have what they call extraordinary and compelling reasons, other than physical and other than being sick or ill, to consider for compassionate release. When you have had great conduct for like 20 years, no disciplinary records, and you've done things, that are outstanding and compelling, you qualify for compassionate release. And as for what do you tell your loved ones who are trying to figure out how to help their loved ones get out on compassionate release, they should form a record of all of the wonderful things that the prisoner inside is doing and has done, conducive to showing that he's no longer a threat to society.
Yeah. Can I just say something about that? First of all, Lynn is a unicorn. He clearly was cryogenically frozen while he was in prison, because he's the youngest old man there's ever been. It's ridiculous. You have more energy than the rest of us.
I don't think we told him I don't think we said how old he was.
I know, but he said he got out for age reasons. How old are you, Lynn?
I'm 72. I'll be 73 this year.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
And I drive 18 wheelers.
I would just say that is a good point that Lynn brought up, that we didn't mention, which is,
and see, I got out because of my conduct and character.
Yeah, but I'm saying
I went to school. I was in class for 6,500 hours to get a certificate, and I had already had a bachelor's degree. I had taken so many classes, so many courses. It was really nothing else for me to do and take. And I had used a lot of my trainings, teachings, knowledge to help in the system. I went to a quality assurance technician apprenticeship program for 4 calendar years in the system, to learn to be a quality assurance technician. And I used that knowledge to in the factories, in the prison factories. I was the inspector. I approved the products being made, the components that were made and shipped, and the prisons make components that shipped all around the world. And I had a position, to be the chief inspector in the factory, to oversee the accuracy of the components, to make sure that everything was being made according to specifications. And years doing this. So when you look back and see what the prisons are doing inside of the prison, it has a whole lot to do with making the consideration of whether to let them out. The positive things that they're doing, they're teaching, training, they're helping the prison system run the prison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kevin?
I was just going to say, because Lynn's was age related, he's right that for the most part, showing good conduct was what was helpful. But, just like when you have a loved one in the hospital, you need an advocate. And so if you're on the outside, you can help your loved one by trying to get medical records and trying to get all the documentation you're going to need to make the case for compassionate release. Because, that's usually the biggest hurdle. And for them, it's hard to do. So, you could be an advocate by calling the warden. You could be calling their case manager or their team unit manager and saying, I want to document these issues. And when they go to the doctor, they need diagnosis. They need to show all that sort of stuff. So, you could be that advocate for your loved one. But also, as Nazgul said, we got to change the laws. They're all too narrow right now. FAMM focused on federal compassionate release, getting people out during COVID because at least there was a process in place that allowed for them. The states don't have them, and we need to create those. So the best thing you could do is be an advocate for reform so that these systems exist going forward.
Great. So we're at time, but I would like to give each of you guys a moment to say anything that I wasn't able to get to or cover, and then also to kind of give some last words to pretty much wrap up the show and to tell people how they can get involved and more about where they can find your work. So I'm going to start with Nazgul.
Thank you. So I would say it's important to remember that compassionate release is sort of the last step in a process where there have been a lot of failures. There was a failure at the point of sentencing where people got an extreme sentence beyond what's necessary for public safety and is a waste of public safety resources. And second, their sentences were not reevaluated before they got to be elderly, before they got to be sick. So this is sort of the last stop and the last chance to fix these mistakes that this person has lived with for so many years. And I would encourage folks who want to learn more about the work that we do at the Sentencing Project around these issues to check out our campaign to end life imprisonment. And we have a website for that, which is www.endlifeimprisonment.org. And we look forward to working with you all and working with FAMM to fix these problems that we have right now in the criminal legal system.
Thank you so much for joining us. Kevin?
Well, I think I'm good. I would just say thanks to Nazgul, the great work that Sentencing Project is doing. Thanks to Lynn for giving us your time and sharing your perspective. Go to famm.org or text FAMM to 21333. It's probably the quickest way to get information. Or if you go to our website, go to Compassion Release. Before you do anything, read up on this and check out what your state laws are. And then we have actions that you can take that just to easily get in touch with your lawmakers to let them know that you care about this. We have people in every district that care. They just need to notify their lawmakers to let them know this is a priority. So thanks to everybody for tuning in and caring about this issue.
Great, Kevin. Lynn, any last words?
Yeah, it's almost impossible for me to leave without saying how important FAMM was to my actual release. As a prisoner, your credibility is very, very low. And no matter what kind of petitions you put before the court, they're not going to be seriously considered because your credibility is damaged. And if FAMM stepped in and got me an actual attorney to represent me, is when it actually expedited my ability to get out of there. Because my petition had pended more than a year just on my pro se application. I didn't have an attorney. I filed for myself. It wasn't moving. Nothing was happening. When FAMM stepped in my behalf, represented me, got me a public defender to represent my petition, it actually expedited my ability to get out on compassionate release, which in turn very well could have saved my life, because I was in a COVID-19 infested nest, and used it to amplify my ability to try to get out. And it was an attorney that FAMM sent to represent my COVID-19 allegations, my COVID-19 implementations to the original petition that got me out. And the FAMM attorney did it. The FAMM organization did it. The program actually is responsible for me being released on compassionate release. I don't think that I would have gotten out had it not been for FAMM. It's a good organization, and I really respect what they do, what they've done, and I respect the sentencing project that Nazolim do and what they're doing. It's one of the most humanitarian things that I can even imagine that you guys are doing, and I just really appreciate it. And I want to thank everybody for what they did for me and what they're doing for everybody else.
Well, thank you so much. It's really hard to follow up on that. I know that as a staff member at FAMM, and Kevin Ring being president, and of course Nazgul and everybody who does this work, those words were deeply heartfelt. We are inspired by people like you every single day, and so again, thank you all for tuning in, and join us in 2 weeks for our next program. But thank you all. Bye.
Good to meet you guys.